Sometimes a man reaches a point in life where he just wants to disappear, to find a quiet corner of the world where his mistakes can't follow him. Clay Donovan thought he'd found that peace when he bought cursed land in Utah that nobody else would touch. For decades, people had whispered about the 100 souls who'd vanished near Mercy Ridge. Clay figured at 70 he could handle a few ghost stories. He just wanted solitude with his dog Bear. But Bear kept leading him to an old cellar behind a crumbling church. When Clay finally opened it, he found underground tunnels filled with the belongings of missing people. There were records, photos, and confessions from a preacher who believed the land was cursed. The preacher had been cleansing it of sin by making people disappear. But the biggest shock came when Clay found his own name carved in that chamber. How does a man solve his own disappearance from 50 years ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Utah high desert as Clay Donovan stood on his front porch, coffee steaming in the thin mountain air. At 70, his hands were weathered leather, scarred from decades of trapping, trading, and surviving in places most folks wouldn't venture. His beard, more silver than brown now, caught the early light as he surveyed the land he'd bought sight unseen, 800 acres of scrub brush. Red rock and whispered warnings. Bear, his golden-eyed companion, stretched lazily beside the cabin steps. The dog had wandered into Clay's camp 3 winters back, half-starved and limping from a leg that had healed crooked. Neither of them were young anymore, but they understood each other in the way that broken things often do. Bear's coat had dulled to a dusty gold, and his muzzle showed white, but his eyes still held the keen intelligence that had kept him alive through whatever hardships brought him to Clay's fire that cold Montana night. The cabin itself was nothing fancy. 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and walls thick enough to keep out the desert wind. Clay had built it himself over the past 6 months, working with the methodical patience of a man who had nowhere else to be. The lumber came from a mill in Moab, the stone from his own land. Every board, every nail had been placed with the careful attention of someone who understood that this might be his last home. Behind the cabin, a weathered barn housed his few possessions, camping gear that had seen better decades, a collection of hunting knives he'd accumulated over the years, and an old Ford pickup that started on good days and required coaxing on bad ones. The truck had brought him here from Montana, loaded with everything he owned, which wasn't much. Clay had learned long ago that the more you carried, the harder it was to move when moving became necessary. The land stretched out before him in waves of sage and juniper, broken by red sandstone formations that thrust up from the earth like ancient monuments. To the east, the ghost town of Mercy Ridge huddled against a low mesa, its few remaining buildings bleached white by decades of sun and abandonment. The old church still stood, its steeple listing slightly to one side, while the rest of the town had slowly surrendered to time and weather. When Clay first heard about the land, the real estate agent in Salt Lake City had been almost apologetic. "Now, Mr. Donovan, I have to tell you about the history," she'd said, shuffling through papers with obvious discomfort. "There have been some incidents over the years. People going missing, probably just folks getting lost in the desert, but the locals, well, they have their stories." Clay had leaned back in the uncomfortable office chair, studying the woman's face. She was young, maybe 30, with the kind of earnest concern that came from never having seen real trouble. "How many incidents?" he'd asked. "The official count is 96 unsolved disappearances dating back to 1894, she'd said, reading from a file. "But some folks say it's more than 100. The last one was in 1973, a family passing through, the Hendersons. They stopped in Mercy Ridge for the night and just vanished. The price had been what convinced Clay. $80,000 for 800 acres was practically theft, even for desert land with questionable water rights. The seller was eager to close, asking no questions about Clay's background or his ability to pay cash. Some transactions were better left simple, and this was one of them. Now standing on his porch with Bear at his side, Clay wondered if the locals might be right about the land being cursed. Not because he believed in ghosts, but because sometimes the worst hauntings came from very human monsters. He'd seen enough of the world to know that evil wore familiar faces and spoke in trusted voices. The missing people might have encountered something far worse than supernatural forces. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles south, a rancher named Tom Weatherby who ran cattle on leased government land. Clay had met him once at the feed store in Moab, a conversation that lasted exactly long enough for Weatherby to warn him about the history of Mercy Ridge and offer to buy the land for half what Clay had paid. When Clay politely declined, Weatherby had shrugged and said, "Your funeral, partner. Just don't come crying when things start getting strange." Strange was relative, Clay figured. He'd spent years in places where strange was just another word for Tuesday. The jungles of Southeast Asia, the mountains of Afghanistan, the frozen wasteland of Alaska's North Slope, all of them had their own versions of strange. A few ghost stories didn't particularly worry a man who'd seen what humans could do to each other when nobody was watching. Bear suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked toward the ghost town. Clay followed his gaze, but saw nothing unusual, just the same sun-bleached buildings and empty streets that had greeted them every morning for the past 6 months. But Bear's instincts were rarely wrong. The dog had an uncanny ability to sense things before they became visible, whether it was weather moving in or trouble on the horizon. "What is it, boy?" Clay asked, setting down his coffee cup. Bear whined softly, then stood and padded down the porch steps, looking back over his shoulder as if to say, "Follow me." This had become a routine over the past few weeks. Bear would lead Clay toward Mercy Ridge, always stopping at the same weathered building, the old church with its tilted steeple and broken windows. The dog would circle the structure nose to the ground, occasionally pawing at loose stones or scraping at the hard-packed earth. Clay had indulged these expeditions, assuming Bear was tracking some desert animal or following an interesting scent. But today felt different. Maybe it was the way Bear moved, with purpose rather than curiosity. Or maybe it was the way the morning light hit the ghost town, casting shadows that seemed to shift and move when Clay wasn't looking directly at them. He'd learned to trust his instincts over the years, and right now they were telling him that Bear might be onto something more significant than a rabbit trail. Clay finished his coffee, set the cup inside the cabin, and grabbed his worn leather jacket from the hook by the door. The mornings were still cold, even in late spring, and the high desert could change from pleasantly warm to bone-chilling in the space of an hour. He checked that his knife was on his belt, an old habit that had kept him alive in various corners of the world, and followed Bear down the dusty path toward Mercy Ridge. The walk took 20 minutes at a comfortable pace. Clay's knees weren't what they used to be, but they still carried him where he needed to go. Bear ranged ahead, occasionally circling back to make sure Clay was following, his tail high and alert. Whatever had caught the dog's attention was definitely in the ghost town. As they approached the church, Clay could see why Bear was so interested. The recent spring rains had washed away some of the accumulated sand and debris around the building's foundation, revealing what looked like dressed stone that didn't match the church's construction. While the church itself was built from local sandstone, these exposed blocks were a different color, darker, more weathered, as if they predated the building above them. Bear went directly to a spot near the church's rear wall, where the ground had settled unevenly. The dog began pawing at the earth with renewed intensity, whining and looking back at Clay with an expression that clearly said, "Pay attention to this." Clay knelt beside Bear and brushed away loose soil with his hands. What he found made him sit back on his heels in surprise. Set into the ground, almost completely hidden by decades of accumulated debris, was what appeared to be a metal door, iron or steel, heavily rusted but still intact. The handle was a simple ring, green with verdigris, but when Clay grasped it and pulled, the door moved. It opened onto darkness, a stone-lined shaft that descended into the earth beneath the church. Cool air drifted up from the depths, carrying scents of dust and something else Clay couldn't quite identify. Something organic and unpleasant that made Bear whine and back away from the opening. Clay had found cellars before, in old homesteads and abandoned towns. They were common enough in this part of the country, used for cold storage before refrigeration became widespread. But this one felt different. The stonework was too sophisticated for a simple root cellar, and the shaft was deeper than necessary for food storage. This looked like it had been built to hide something, not just to keep vegetables cool. Standing at the edge of the opening, Clay realized that Bear's obsession with this spot might not have been random at all. The dog had been trying to tell him something for weeks, leading him to this exact location again and again. Now Clay had to decide whether to satisfy his curiosity or leave the past buried where someone had clearly intended it to stay. The smart thing would be to cover the door and forget about it. Clay had come to Utah to escape the past, not to dig it up. But as he stood there in the morning sun, looking down into the darkness beneath the old church, he knew that Bear wouldn't let it rest. And if he was honest with himself, neither would he. Some doors, once discovered, demanded to be opened. Clay returned to the cabin for supplies, his mind churning with possibilities. Bear had discovered something significant, and after 50 years of trusting his instincts, Clay wasn't about to ignore them now. He gathered a heavy-duty flashlight, rope, and his grandfather's mining helmet, relics from his younger days, working copper claims in Montana. The helmet still held a working carbide lamp, though Clay preferred the reliability of LED lights these days. The afternoon sun was high when they returned to the church, casting shorter shadows that made the ghost town appear even more desolate. Clay had spent the walk considering what he might find below ground. Best-case scenario, an old storage cellar with nothing more interesting than rotted wooden shelves and maybe some forgotten preserves. Worst case, evidence that would explain why so many people had vanished near Mercy Ridge over the decades. Securing the rope to the church's foundation stones, Clay lowered himself into the shaft. The metal door opened onto a vertical passage lined with carefully fitted stones that spoke of skilled craftsmanship. Someone had taken considerable time and effort to build this properly. As Clay descended, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the air grew thick with the scent of old earth and something else, something that made his combat-trained senses prickle with warning. The shaft ended in a horizontal tunnel, wider than Clay had expected and tall enough for him to stand upright. His flashlight beam revealed walls lined with the same fitted stone, creating a passage that stretched beyond the reach of his light in both directions. This wasn't a simple cellar. This was a deliberate construction, built to move people or goods unseen. Bear's anxious whining echoed down from above, but the dog refused to follow Clay into the tunnel. That alone told Clay he was dealing with something serious. Bear had faced down mountain lions and winter storms without flinching, but whatever lay in these tunnels had the dog spooked. Clay chose to go left first, moving carefully along the tunnel with his flashlight sweeping ahead of him. The air was stale but breathable, suggesting these passages connected to the surface somewhere. After 50 yards, the tunnel opened into a wider chamber carved from the living rock. Clay's light revealed wooden shelves along the walls, most collapsed with age, but some still holding their contents. Personal belongings. Suitcases, handbags, children's toys, clothing, all arranged with methodical precision. Clay approached the nearest shelf and examined a leather travel bag. The brass nameplate read, Henderson Family, Denver, Colorado. The same Hendersons the real estate agent had mentioned, the family that vanished in 1973. His blood ran cold as he continued examining the shelves. Each section was labeled with dates going back decades. 1971, James Morrison, Traveler. 1969, Susan and David Clark, Honeymooners. 1965, Father. Miguel Santos, Missionary. The dates stretched back through the years. A systematic catalogue of the disappeared. Clay's hands trembled as he reached for a small wooden box marked 1952. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, was a woman's wedding ring and a photograph of a young couple standing beside a car. The man in the photo looked familiar, though Clay couldn't place where he might have seen the face. Beneath the photograph was a driver's license. Robert Thomas Donovan, age 24, Montana. The name hit Clay like a physical blow. Donovan, his own surname, though he'd never heard of a Robert Thomas in his family tree. Clay studied the photograph more closely, and understanding crept over him like ice water. The young man in the picture had Clay's jaw, his build, his eyes. This wasn't just someone with the same last name. This was family. With shaking hands, Clay continued searching through the belongings in the 1952 section. He found letters addressed to Bobby Donovan from someone named Margaret, speaking of wedding plans and dreams of starting fresh out west. There was a bus ticket from Billings to Salt Lake City and a handwritten note that made Clay's blood freeze. If you're reading this, they got me too. The preacher knows about the others. Look for the records in the deep chamber. Tell Margaret I tried to come home. RTD. Clay had to steady himself against the stone wall. Robert Thomas Donovan, Bobby, had been here in 1952, had vanished like all the others, had left behind a woman named Margaret, who probably spent years wondering what happened to her fiancé. And somehow, impossibly, Clay was connected to this man whose face mirrored his own. But the note mentioned records in a deep chamber. Clay forced himself to continue exploring, though every instinct screamed at him to flee. The tunnel system was more extensive than he'd imagined, branching in multiple directions like the roots of some vast, terrible tree. He followed the main passage deeper underground, past more storage chambers filled with the possessions of the vanished. The deeper chamber, Bobby's note mentioned, lay at the end of the longest tunnel, behind a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands. The door wasn't locked, it didn't need to be, this far underground. Clay pushed it open and stepped into a room that took his breath away. The chamber was larger than the others, with a vaulted ceiling and walls lined with wooden filing cabinets. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with papers, photographs, and what appeared to be meticulous records. Oil lamps provided illumination. Someone had been down here recently enough to keep them maintained. Clay approached the desk with mounting dread. The papers were organized into neat stacks, each labeled with dates and names. These weren't just records of the missing people. They were planning documents. Maps showing travel routes into the area, schedules of when different families or individuals would arrive, and detailed notes about each victim's background, possessions, and reasons for traveling through Mercy Ridge. But it was the photographs that made Clay's stomach turn. Picture after picture of people arriving in the ghost town, taken from hiding places with a telephoto lens. The same people whose belongings filled the storage chambers above. The photos showed them alive, unaware they were being watched, documented, and prepared for whatever fate had befallen them. At the bottom of one stack, Clay found a leather-bound journal filled with cramped handwriting. The first entry was dated 1894. The Lord has shown me the corruption that passes through our sacred valley. Mercy Ridge must be cleansed of the sinners who defile this holy ground with their presence. I'm the instrument of his righteous judgment. The journal chronicled decades of systematic murder, written in the increasingly deranged handwriting of someone who believed he was doing God's work. The author, who identified himself as Reverend Josiah Blackwood, described each killing in clinical detail, justifying every death as a necessary cleansing of the land. He wrote about luring travelers to the church, drugging them, and disposing of their bodies in the deep chambers of his underground complex. Clay flipped through pages of madness, seeing the gradual deterioration of a man's sanity as he convinced himself that murder was righteousness. Blackwood had operated for decades, using the church as bait and the tunnel system as his killing ground. The missing people hadn't been victims of the cursed land. They'd been victims of a man who thought he was serving heaven while creating hell. But the final entries in the journal made Clay's hands shake. The last dated entry was from 1973. The Henderson family was the final test. The Lord has shown me that my earthly mission is complete. I have prepared the chambers below for one final cleansing, my own. But first, I must ensure the truth is preserved for whoever might someday discover this sacred work. The names of all the cleansed are carved in the stone of the deepest chamber, so their purification might be remembered until the end of days. Below that entry, in different handwriting and darker ink, someone had added, "Blackwood is dead." Found him in the deep chamber where he carved all the names. But he made a mistake with the last one. Clay Donovan wasn't just passing through in 1973. He was one of us. One of the cleaners sent to shut down this operation. But something went wrong. Check the military files. The official story isn't true. Clay stared at the addendum, his mind reeling. His own name, written in someone else's handwriting in a journal that supposedly ended in 1973. But Clay remembered 1973. He'd been 23 years old, fresh out of basic training, assigned to routine duties stateside. He'd never been to Utah, never heard of Mercy Ridge, never been involved in any cleaning operation, or had he? As Clay stood in that underground chamber, surrounded by the evidence of decades of murder, memories began stirring, fragments of dreams he dismissed as nightmares, flashes of faces he couldn't quite place. The persistent feeling that he'd been running from something for most of his adult life. Something had happened in 1973. Something involving this place, these tunnels, and a mission he couldn't remember. And now, 50 years later, Bear had led him back to uncover the truth he'd somehow forgotten. The question wasn't just who had killed all these people anymore. The question was what role Clay Donovan had played in covering it up, and why his own memory of those events had been erased. Clay spent the night staring at the ceiling of his cabin, the journal's final entry playing over and over in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw fragmented images, flashes of faces in military uniforms, the sound of helicopters, and always that persistent sense that he was forgetting something crucial. Bear seemed to sense his distress, staying close and occasionally whining softly in the darkness. By morning, Clay had made a decision. If he'd been involved in some kind of military operation in 1973, there would be records. The government might have classified the details, but they couldn't erase every trace. He needed to understand what had happened to him, and more importantly, what had happened to the hundreds of people whose belongings filled those underground chambers. After feeding Bear and making coffee, Clay drove his old Ford pickup to the library in Moab. The librarian, a sharp-eyed woman named Dorothy Chen, helped him access the newspaper archives on microfiche. Clay started with 1973, searching for any mention of Mercy Ridge, missing persons, or unusual military activity in the area. What he found was a pattern of deliberate silence. The disappearances were mentioned sporadically, always as isolated incidents, never connected as part of a larger pattern. The Henderson family's vanishing had rated 3 paragraphs in the Salt Lake Tribune, buried on page 8. Other disappearances weren't mentioned at all in the mainstream press, but Clay had learned long ago that the absence of information was often information itself. Someone had worked very hard to keep these stories out of the newspapers. That kind of systematic suppression required resources and authority, the kind that came with government backing. "You're looking for something specific," Dorothy observed, bringing him another roll of microfiche. "Local history research?" Clay considered how much to tell her. "Family history, trying to track down a relative who went missing in the early 70s. Dorothy's expression softened. "I'm sorry to hear that. You might want to check the county records office. They keep missing person reports going back decades. And there's an old-timer named Pete Garrison who runs the antique shop on Main Street. He's lived here all his life. If anyone remembers the old stories, it would be Pete." Clay thanked her and drove to the county offices, where a bored clerk helped him access the missing person files. The official records painted a different picture than the newspaper accounts. Between 1894 and 1973, the Moab Sheriff's Office had investigated over 200 disappearances in the Mercy Ridge area. 200, not the 100 that local folklore claimed. The reports followed a depressing pattern. People would arrive in the area, often stopping in Mercy Ridge for the night, and simply vanish. Search parties would find abandoned vehicles, scattered belongings, but never any trace of the missing individuals themselves. The investigations would continue for a few weeks, then quietly close without resolution. But the files from 1973 were different. In late September of that year, the reports stopped. Not just the disappearances, all investigations ceased abruptly. The final file contained a single typed page: Mercy Ridge Investigations, suspended by federal authority. All case files transferred to Department of Defense. Local law enforcement advised to redirect missing person inquiries to federal channels. The signature at the bottom was illegible, but the departmental stamp was clear. United States Army Criminal Investigation Division. Clay photographed the page with his phone and left the county building with more questions than answers. If the Army had taken over the investigation in 1973, that suggested they'd already known about the murders. But why would the military be interested in the crimes of a deranged preacher? Unless there was more to Reverend Blackwood's operation than religious mania. Pete Garrison's antique shop was exactly what Clay expected: a cramped maze of old furniture, vintage signs, and the accumulated detritus of a desert town's history. Pete himself was a weathered man in his 80s, with the kind of deep tan that came from decades under the desert sun. "You're the fellow who bought the Mercy Ridge land," Pete said without preamble. Figured someone would show up asking questions eventually. Clay browsed through a collection of old mining tools while they talked. "What kind of questions?" "The kind about why so many folks went missing out there over the years. And about what really happened when the government boys came through in 73. Clay's hand stilled on an antique pickaxe. "You remember the government investigators?" Pete laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Remember them? Hell, I was the one who called them in. After the Henderson family disappeared, I started putting pieces together, talking to other old-timers, comparing stories. We figured out that folks had been vanishing near that ghost town for near on 80 years. So, you contacted the authorities?" "Tried to. Local sheriff said it wasn't his jurisdiction. Too many of the disappearances happened on federal land. State police said they didn't have resources for a cold case investigation. Finally got frustrated enough to write a letter to my congressman. That's when things got interesting." Pete moved behind the counter and pulled out a shoebox filled with old papers. 3 days after I mailed that letter, I had visitors. Army fellows in nice suits, asking all sorts of questions about what I knew and who I'd talked to. They were very polite, very professional, and very clear that I should keep my theories to myself. "Did they tell you what they found?" "Not directly, but they spent 6 weeks out there with trucks, heavy equipment, and enough personnel to staff a small base. Whatever they were doing, it wasn't just investigating a few missing persons. They were cleaning up something big." Pete handed Clay a faded photograph from the shoebox. It showed a convoy of military vehicles parked near the Mercy Ridge Church, with soldiers in hazmat suits working around what appeared to be excavation equipment. "Took this with a telephoto lens from about a mile away," Pete said. "Those boys didn't want any witnesses to their work." Clay studied the photograph, feeling another tickle of recognition he couldn't quite place. The scene looked familiar in a way that made his chest tight with anxiety. "What do you think they found?" "Bodies," Pete said without hesitation. "Lots of them. And something else that scared them enough to classify the whole operation. Because when they left, they took everything with them. Every scrap of evidence, every witness statement, every local memory they could suppress." "Local memories." Pete's expression grew grim. "Funny thing about government cleanup operations. Sometimes the cleaners need cleaning too." There were 5 local boys who helped with the excavation. Young men from town who needed work and weren't asking too many questions. 3 of them died in accidents over the next 2 years. One moved away and was never heard from again. The 5th one suffered what the doctors called severe amnesia after a hiking accident. Clay felt ice form in his stomach. Amnesia? Complete memory loss about everything that happened during those 6 weeks. Doctor said it was consistent with head trauma, but the boy swore he never hit his head. Just woke up one morning and couldn't remember the previous month and a half. Do you remember his name? Pete studied Clay's face for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Why don't you tell me yours first? Clay Donovan, Pete nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. The boy who lost his memory was named Clayton Donovan. Went by Clay. He was about 23 then, fresh out of the army, working odd jobs while he figured out what to do with his life. The antique shop seemed to spin around Clay. He gripped the edge of the counter to steady himself as the implications crashed over him. He hadn't just been involved in the 1973 cleanup operation. He'd been one of the local workers. His amnesia hadn't been caused by an accident. It had been induced to protect whatever secrets lay buried beneath Mercy Ridge. "You're him, aren't you?" Pete asked quietly. "You came back." Clay nodded, not trusting his voice. "Then you need to be very careful," Pete said, "because whoever arranged your memory loss 50 years ago might not be happy to see you digging around in the past. And if they were willing to kill 3 other witnesses to keep their secrets buried, they might be willing to kill again." Clay spent the drive back to his cabin in a fog of disbelief and growing fear. The man in Pete's photograph was him, younger, thinner, but unmistakably him. He could almost remember being there, working alongside soldiers in hazmat suits, hauling equipment and helping with the excavation. But the memories felt like scenes from a half-remembered movie, vivid but disconnected from any emotional context. Bear was waiting on the porch when Clay arrived, tail wagging but eyes alert. The dog had been restless all day, pacing and whining whenever Clay was out of sight. Now Bear pressed close against Clay's legs, as if sensing that the world had shifted in some fundamental way. That evening, Clay sat at his kitchen table with Pete's photograph spread before him, along with copies of the military transfer documents and the few newspaper clippings he'd managed to find. The pieces of a puzzle were scattered in front of him, but he couldn't see the complete picture yet. What he could see was deeply troubling. The timeline was clear. Reverend Blackwood had operated his killing ground from 1894 to 1973, murdering over 200 people and storing their belongings in his underground chambers. But something in 1973 had triggered federal intervention on a massive scale. Not just an investigation, a full military cleanup operation with hazmat teams and classified protocols. Clay opened Blackwood's journal again, rereading the final entries. The preacher's last words before his apparent suicide were telling, "The Lord has shown me that my earthly mission is complete." But what had convinced a man who'd spent 8 decades murdering travelers that his work was suddenly finished? The handwritten addendum in different ink suggested an answer. Blackwood is dead. Found him in the deep chamber where he carved all the names. But he made a mistake with the last one. What mistake? Clay studied the journal's earlier entries, looking for patterns. Blackwood had been methodical in his killings, careful to choose victims who wouldn't be missed immediately. Drifters, travelers, people passing through, rather than locals with established ties to the community. But in his final years, the entries showed increasing paranoia and decreasing clarity. Clay found what he was looking for in an entry dated 6 months before Blackwood's death. The corruption spreads beyond the travelers now. I have seen the signs, local boys accepting the devil's coin to serve federal masters. The government sends agents to test my resolve, but I will not be deterred. Even if they wear the faces of neighbors, I will cleanse this valley of their influence. The preacher had started targeting locals, specifically young men working for the federal government. If Clay had been part of some kind of advance team or investigation, he might have become one of Blackwood's targets. But something had gone wrong with that final killing. Something significant enough to trigger the massive cleanup operation. Clay's hands trembled as he turned to the back of the journal, where Blackwood had recorded his final plans. The handwriting was increasingly erratic, but the words were chilling. The federal boy has been marked for cleansing, but the Lord shows me a greater purpose. Through him, I will send a message to those who would corrupt this sacred valley. His death will be witnessed, recorded, and preserved as a warning to all who follow. That was it. Blackwood hadn't just planned to kill Clay. He'd planned to make it a spectacle, probably filmed or photographed as evidence of what happened to government agents who ventured into his territory. But the plan had backfired somehow, resulting in Blackwood's own death instead. The question was, what had Clay done to survive? And why couldn't he remember any of it? A soft knock on the cabin door interrupted Clay's thoughts. He glanced at the clock, nearly 10 p.m., far too late for casual visitors in this remote location. Bear growled low in his throat, hackles rising as he stared at the door. Clay quietly closed the journal and moved to the window beside the door. A man stood on his porch, tall, thin, wearing an expensive suit that looked out of place in the desert. Behind him, Clay could see a black sedan parked next to his pickup truck. "Mr. Donovan?" the man called. "My name is Agent Morrison. I'm with the Department of Defense. I'd like to speak with you about your recent activities." Clay's blood ran cold. Morrison, the same name he'd seen on one of the belongings in Blackwood's storage chamber. James Morrison, listed as a traveler who disappeared in 1971. But this man was far too young to be the same person. "It's late," Clay called through the door. "Come back in the morning. I'm afraid this can't wait, sir. We have reason to believe you've discovered materials related to a classified military operation. For national security reasons, I need to speak with you immediately." Clay checked that his rifle was loaded and within reach. "What operation would that be?" "Operation Clean Sweep, Mr. Donovan. The 1973 cleanup at Mercy Ridge. We understand you've recovered certain documents and artifacts from the site." The name meant nothing to Clay, but the man's knowledge of his recent discoveries was deeply troubling. Someone had been watching him, tracking his movements to the library, the county offices, and Pete's antique shop. The same someone's who'd arranged his amnesia 50 years ago. "I haven't recovered anything," Clay lied. "Just been exploring my property." "Sir, I need you to understand that the materials you've discovered are classified at the highest levels. The documents in your possession could compromise ongoing national security operations if they were to become public. I'm here to help you understand the situation and arrange for the proper handling of these materials." Clay moved away from the window and positioned himself where he could see both the front and back doors. Bear had gone silent, but his body was coiled with tension, ready to attack on command. "What kind of help are you offering?" "The same kind we provided in 1973, Morrison said, and his tone had shifted from professional courtesy to something much colder. "A comprehensive solution to a complex problem. You cooperated with us once before, Mr. Donovan. We're hoping you'll be equally reasonable now. And if I'm not reasonable..." The silence stretched long enough that Clay began to wonder if Morrison had left. Then the man spoke again, and his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Then we'll handle this the same way we handled the other witnesses from 1973. 3 accidents and 1 case of convenient amnesia. But you're older now, Mr. Donovan, more fragile. We might not be able to be as gentle as we were before." Clay felt pieces of his lost memories stirring, fragments of conversations, faces of men in suits, the feeling of being trapped between impossible choices. They hadn't just erased his memory of the cleanup operation. They'd threatened him, forced his cooperation, and then made him forget the coercion along with everything else. But this time, he wasn't a naive 23-year-old who could be easily intimidated. This time, he had nothing left to lose, and plenty of reasons to fight back. "Agent Morrison," Clay called. "I want you to know something. I spent 40 years after 1973 working in places where men like you come to die. Whatever you think you can do to me, I promise you've never dealt with anyone quite like me." He heard Morrison's footsteps moving across the porch, circling the cabin like a predator testing for weaknesses. But Clay had built this place with defense in mind, thick walls, limited sight lines, and only 2 ways in or out. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Donovan," Morrison called from somewhere near the back of the cabin. "Think carefully about your choices. The amnesia option won't be available twice." Clay waited until he heard the sedan's engine start and the sound of tires on gravel fading into the distance. Only then did he allow himself to breathe normally again. Morrison's visit had confirmed his worst fears. The people responsible for the 1973 cover-up were still active, still powerful, and still willing to kill to protect their secrets, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd given him time to prepare, and Clay Donovan had learned a great deal about preparation in the 50 years since his memory had been stolen. This time, when they came for him, he'd be ready. Clay didn't sleep that night. Instead, he prepared for war. By dawn, he had moved the most important documents to a hiding place in the rocks behind his cabin, somewhere that would take heavy equipment to access. Blackwood's journal, Pete's photograph, and copies of all the military transfer documents were sealed in waterproof containers and cached where only he could find them. If Morrison's people came back, they wouldn't find everything they were looking for. Bear seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, staying close and alert as Clay worked. The dog's behavior had changed since they'd discovered the underground chambers, less playful, more protective, as if he sensed that the past they'd unearthed carried present dangers. As the sun rose over the desert, Clay made coffee and sat on his porch with his rifle across his knees. Morrison had said they'd be in touch, but Clay doubted they'd wait long. Whatever Operation Clean Sweep had accomplished in 1973, it was important enough to kill for 50 years later. That suggested the cover-up involved more than just hiding a serial killer's crimes. The answer came to him as he watched the morning light hit the ruins of Mercy Ridge. The hazmat suits in Pete's photograph weren't just for handling decomposed bodies. They were for dealing with something that required serious contamination protocols, something chemical, biological or radiological that posed an ongoing threat. Clay had worked enough black operations to recognize the signs. Clean Sweep hadn't been a criminal investigation, it had been a containment operation. The question was, what had Reverend Blackwood been doing in those underground chambers besides murder? The sound of vehicles approaching broke his train of thought. 3 black SUVs were coming up the dirt road to his cabin, moving fast and kicking up clouds of dust. Clay counted at least 12 people as the vehicles stopped and men in tactical gear poured out. Morrison emerged from the lead vehicle, no longer bothering with the pretense of courtesy. "Mr. Donovan," Morrison called through a bullhorn, "you're surrounded by federal agents. We need you to come out with your hands visible and surrender any materials you've removed from the Mercy Ridge site." Clay didn't move from his porch. Bear growled low beside him, but Clay kept a restraining hand on the dog's neck. "I told you last night, I haven't removed anything. Sir, we have surveillance footage of you entering and exiting the underground chambers multiple times over the past week. We know you've been in contact with local residents who have knowledge of classified operations. For national security reasons, we need to debrief you and recover any materials in your possession." "What's really down there, Morrison?" Clay called back. "Because if it was just a serial killer's collection, you wouldn't need this many guns to get it back." Morrison stepped forward, flanked by 2 agents with assault rifles. "Mr. Donovan, you're a former military contractor with security clearances. You understand the concept of need to know. Right now, you don't need to know." "I think I do." Clay stood slowly, keeping his rifle pointed at the ground but ready to move quickly. "Especially since my name is carved in stone, down there next to 200 murder victims." That got Morrison's attention. The agent paused, then spoke quietly into a radio before approaching closer to the cabin. "What exactly did you find down there?" "Why don't you tell me?" "You were part of the cleanup crew in 1973. You know what Blackwood was really doing." Morrison's face went pale. "That's impossible. James Morrison died in 1971. He was one of Blackwood's victims. Then who are you?" The man calling himself Morrison stared at Clay for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. When he spoke again, his voice was different, older, more tired. "I'm David Morrison. James was my father." The admission hung in the desert air like smoke. Clay felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The son of one of Blackwood's victims, working for the agency that had covered up his father's murder. That explained the personal investment in keeping the truth buried. "How long have you known?" Clay asked. Since 1995, when I got high enough clearance to read the classified files. I learned that my father hadn't died in a hiking accident like we'd been told. He'd been investigating reports of missing persons near Mercy Ridge when Blackwood killed him, and you decided to help cover it up. Morrison's jaw tightened. I decided to make sure it stayed buried. Do you have any idea what would happen if the truth about Mercy Ridge became public? Not just the murders, the other thing. The reason we needed hazmat suits and containment protocols. Tell me. Morrison looked around at his team, then made a decision that Clay could see forming in the man's posture.
Stand down, he ordered the other agents.
Perimeter watch only. When they were alone except for Bear, Morrison sat heavily on the porch steps. He suddenly looked older than his apparent age, worn down by years of carrying impossible secrets. Blackwood wasn't just a serial killer, Morrison said. He was conducting experiments. Chemical and biological weapons research for a foreign government. The missing people weren't just victims, they were test subjects. Clay felt the world tilt around him. What kind of experiments? Nerve agents, biological toxins, things that make sarin gas look like perfume. Blackwood had been recruited by Soviet intelligence in the 1950s, but he'd been working for them much longer than that. The religious mania was just a cover story. He was using isolated travelers as test subjects because nobody would miss them or connect their disappearances to a larger pattern. And the government knew. Not until 1973, when my father's investigation got too close to the truth. The Soviets decided Blackwood had become a liability and ordered him to eliminate all witnesses, including my father. But Blackwood had gone completely insane by then. He killed my father, but he also kept detailed records of everything he'd done for his handlers. Morrison pulled out a tablet and showed Clay a series of photographs, documents in Russian, chemical formulas and test results written in Blackwood's increasingly erratic handwriting. When our people finally raided the site, they found enough weapons-grade biological material to wipe out half of Utah. The underground chambers weren't just storage areas for personal belongings. They were laboratories, production facilities, and burial grounds for people who died screaming from exposure to things that shouldn't exist. Clay stared at the photographs, memories stirring like dust in an old room. He remembered now. Fragments of suited figures moving through underground tunnels, the acrid smell of chemicals being neutralized, and the terrible knowledge that they were cleaning up something that could have killed thousands. You were there, Morrison continued, part of the local crew that helped with the decontamination. You saw things that could have exposed the entire operation if you'd talked. So they gave you a choice. Forget everything, or join the people who'd already died from convenient accidents. And I chose to forget. Wouldn't you? You were 23 years old, with your whole life ahead of you. The alternative was disappearing like the other witnesses. Clay felt anger building in his chest, not just at Morrison and his people, but at his younger self for accepting the coward's way out. So you've been watching me all these years? Periodic check-ins? Making sure the memory suppression held. It was supposed to be permanent, but sometimes trauma can break through the conditioning. When our monitoring systems detected that you'd purchased land near Mercy Ridge, we knew we had a problem. Your monitoring systems? Morrison looked uncomfortable. Facial recognition software, credit monitoring, cell phone tracking. We've been keeping tabs on all the surviving witnesses for 50 years. Standard protocol for classified operations. Bear suddenly stood and began growling at something beyond the cabin. Clay followed the dog's gaze and saw dust clouds on the horizon, more vehicles approaching from the south. Morrison saw them too and reached for his radio. "Control, this is Morrison. Are those our people?" The response made his face go white. "Negative. Unknown vehicles approaching your position. Recommend immediate extraction." Morrison looked at Clay with something that might have been regret. "I'm sorry, Mr. Donovan. This conversation is over. Who's coming?" "The same people who've been cleaning up loose ends for 50 years. And they don't make deals." The approaching vehicles weren't government issue. Clay could tell from their movement pattern. Too aggressive, too direct, without the cautious professionalism that characterized federal operations. These people were coming to kill, not to negotiate. Morrison was already shouting orders to his team, but Clay grabbed his arm. Who are they? Private contractors. The kind that specializes in permanent solutions to temporary problems. Morrison's face was grim. When the original Operation Clean Sweep ended, some of the participants went into business for themselves. They've been handling the maintenance of this operation ever since. Maintenance. Making sure witnesses stay quiet. Permanently. Clay felt the familiar calm that came before combat. After 50 years of trying to forget, he was finally remembering who he used to be. How many? Morrison checked his binoculars. At least 20. Military vehicles, heavy weapons. They're not here to take prisoners. Then we better not give them any. Clay whistled for Bear and headed for the cabin. His go-bag was already packed. Old habits from decades of staying ready to move quickly. He grabbed ammunition, emergency supplies, and the backup copies of documents he'd prepared. Morrison's people might be federal agents, but right now, they were the only thing standing between Clay and the killers approaching from the south. There's something else you need to know, Morrison said as they prepared defensive positions. The biological weapons research didn't end in 1973. Some of Blackwood's work survived the cleanup. The contractors who are coming for us, they've been using his research for the past 50 years. Clay paused in loading his rifle. Using it how? Selective assassinations. Political eliminations. Anyone who gets too close to certain classified operations. Blackwood's toxins were perfect because they mimicked natural causes of death. Heart attacks, strokes, sudden illnesses, all traceable to exposure to substances that broke down in the bloodstream within hours. And you've known about this? Morrison's expression was bleak. I've suspected. But proving it would have meant exposing. Everything about Mercy Ridge, my superiors, made it clear that some secrets are worth more than individual lives. The first shots came from long range, sniper fire that shattered the cabin's front windows and sent Morrison's agents scrambling for cover. Clay dropped behind the thick stone foundation of his porch, Bear pressed against his side. The attackers were professionals, using suppressing fire to advance on the cabin in coordinated teams. But Clay had chosen his location well. The cabin sat on high ground with clear fields of fire in all directions. The attackers would have to cross open ground to reach them, and Clay had spent months learning every rock and gully in the surrounding terrain. Can you still shoot? Clay asked Morrison, who was crouched behind an overturned table. It's been a while, but yes. Then take the south windows. I'll handle the north approach. Clay checked his ammunition count and settled into a firing position. And Morrison? After we get through this, you and I are going to have a longer conversation about what really happened in 1973. The battle was brief, but intense. The contractors moved with military precision, but they'd underestimated both the defensive advantages of Clay's position and the combat experience of the people they were trying to kill. Morrison's agents might have been bureaucrats, but they were well-trained bureaucrats. And Clay fought with the cold efficiency of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of survival. When the shooting stopped, 8 of the contractors lay dead in the desert scrub around the cabin. The survivors had withdrawn to regroup, leaving behind their wounded and their heavy weapons. It was a tactical retreat, not a defeat. They'd be back with a better plan and more firepower. We need to move, Morrison said, binding a flesh wound on his arm. They'll call for backup, and next time they'll bring helicopter support. Clay was already gathering essential supplies. Where? There's a federal safe house in Grand Junction. We can hold out there until— No! Clay's voice was flat with certainty. Running just gives them time to bring more people. We end this here or it never ends. Morrison stared at him. You want to fight them? I want to finish what we started in 1973. The truth about Mercy Ridge needs to come out, and the people who've been covering it up need to be stopped. You don't understand the scope of this operation. It's not just about Blackwood's research anymore. It's grown into something much larger. The contractors, the weapons development, the political assassinations, it's all connected to a network that reaches into the highest levels of government. Clay shouldered his rifle and started walking toward the ghost town. Then it's time to bring that network down. The underground chambers beneath the church had taken on a different character in the afternoon light filtering down through cracks in the stone. Clay led Morrison and two surviving federal agents through the tunnels, showing them the full scope of Blackwood's operation. The storage chambers filled with personal belongings, the laboratory spaces with their chemical residue and improvised equipment, and finally, the deepest chamber where Blackwood had carved the names of his victims into the living rock. Morrison stared at the carved walls in horrified fascination. "Jesus, there are so many!" 212, Clay said, running his fingers over the rough stone. "I counted them all. Men, women, children, whole families who just wanted to pass through this valley safely, but it was the final chamber that held the most important discovery. Behind a false wall that Clay had missed on his earlier explorations, they found Blackwood's complete research archive. Not just the journal and scattered papers, but comprehensive documentation of 50 years of weapons development, including detailed records of every toxin produced and every test conducted. "This is it," Morrison breathed, photographing page after page of chemical formulas and test results. "This is everything we need to expose the entire operation." Clay was studying a different set of documents, personnel files on the Soviet agents who'd handled Blackwood, and more disturbing, a list of American contacts who'd continued the research after Blackwood's death, names he recognized from decades of political headlines. Military contractors, pharmaceutical executives, and government officials who'd built careers on foundations of murder and biological warfare. "We're not just dealing with a cover-up," Clay said quietly. "We're dealing with treason. Some of these people sold American citizens to foreign intelligence agencies as test subjects." Morrison's radio crackled with urgent transmissions. The surviving contractors had regrouped and were calling in additional support. But they'd also made a crucial mistake. They were coordinating their communications through channels that Morrison's people could intercept. "They're planning to level the entire site," Morrison reported. "Helicopter gunships, followed by a demolition team to destroy any remaining evidence." Clay looked around the chamber that had become both tomb and treasure trove. In a few hours, it would all be buried under tons of rubble, the truth lost forever, along with the evidence of decades of institutionalized murder. Unless they got the story out first. "How long do we have?" "Maybe 2 hours before the helicopters arrive." Clay began gathering the most critical documents. "Then we better work fast." Clay was photographing the final pages of Blackwood's research when he found the document that changed everything. Tucked between chemical formulas and test results was a single sheet of paper that made his blood run cold. It was a military transfer order, dated September 15, 1973, reassigning Corporal Clayton Donovan from the 82nd Airborne Division to a classified joint operation under the command of Colonel James Harrison. But that wasn't what stopped Clay's heart. It was the signature at the bottom of the order, his own signature, but in handwriting he'd never seen before. Beneath it, in the same unfamiliar script, was a single line: "I understand the terms of my participation and accept full responsibility for necessary actions." "Morrison," Clay called, his voice tight with confusion. "Look at this." Morrison studied the document, his face growing pale. "This is impossible. According to our files, you were drafted as local support. You weren't military personnel. I was 82nd Airborne. But I don't remember any of this. Not the transfer, not the assignment, not signing this document." Clay continued searching through the papers, finding more documents that made no sense. Personnel evaluations, describing him as a specialist in close-quarters combat and interrogation techniques. Mission reports detailing his participation in operations he'd never heard of. And most disturbing of all, a psychological evaluation that recommended him for memory modification protocols due to his increasing reluctance to follow necessary directives. "I wasn't just a witness," Clay said slowly, the implications crashing over him like ice water. "I was part of the team. I knew about the biological weapons. I helped cover up the murders. Morrison was studying another document, a detailed report on the final confrontation with Blackwood. As he read, his expression shifted from confusion to horror. "Clay, according to this report, you didn't just survive Blackwood's attack. You killed him." The world seemed to tilt around Clay as Morrison read from the report. Corporal Donovan successfully infiltrated Subject's compound under cover of being a potential victim. When Subject attempted to add Donovan to his collection, Donovan overpowered him and executed him according to mission parameters. Recovery of research materials proceeded as planned. Clay stared at the document, fragments of memory stirring like sediment in dark water. He could almost see it, Blackwood's face twisted with religious madness. The underground chamber lit by flickering oil lamps. The feel of hands around a throat as an old man died beneath him. "I was an assassin," Clay whispered. "They sent me to kill Blackwood and make it look like self-defense." But Morrison was still reading, and his next words shattered what remained of Clay's understanding of the past. "Clay, there's more. According to this final report, you didn't just kill Blackwood, you helped continue his research. The biological weapons program didn't end in 1973, it was relocated. And you were one of the people who made that possible." Morrison showed him a series of photographs attached to the report. Images of Clay, younger but unmistakably him, working alongside scientists in a modern laboratory, handling vials of biological material, taking notes on chemical formulas, and in one particularly damning photo, injecting an unknown substance into a restrained test subject. "The memory modification wasn't just to make you forget witnessing the cleanup," Morrison said quietly. "It was to make you forget participating in mass murder." Clay's legs gave out, and he sat heavily on the stone floor of the chamber. Everything he'd believed about himself, everything he'd built his identity on for 50 years, was a lie. He wasn't a victim of the Mercy Ridge conspiracy. He was one of its architects. "How many?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Morrison continued reading through the files. "According to these records, you participated in the program for 18 months after Blackwood's death. The research was moved to a facility in Nevada, where they continued testing Blackwood's toxins on prisoners and political dissidents. How many people did I help kill? The body count isn't specified, but there are references to subjects 1 through 47 during your period of service." Clay closed his eyes, trying to summon memories of the faces Morrison was describing. But there was nothing, just the same empty space where his recollections of 1973 should have been. Whoever had designed his memory modification had been thorough. "Why?" Clay asked. "Why would I have agreed to something like that?" Morrison found the answer in a personnel file that made Clay's stomach turn. According to the documents, Clay's family had been used as leverage. His younger sister Margaret, the same Margaret mentioned in Bobby Donovan's belongings, had been arrested on drug charges that would have sent her to prison for decades. Clay's cooperation with the biological weapons program had been the price of her freedom. They had Margaret, Clay said, the name triggering a flood of emotions he couldn't quite place. "She was the only family I had left after our parents died. According to this, she was released after your 18 months of service were complete. The charges were dropped and she was relocated with a new identity for her protection." Clay stared at the documents that chronicled his transformation from soldier to assassin to unwilling amnesia victim. But it was the final entry in his file that provided the most devastating revelation of all. The subject's psychological evaluation indicates increasing instability and resistance to continued participation, Morrison read. "Recommend immediate termination of subject's involvement and implementation of comprehensive memory modification." Subject's knowledge of program details makes him an unacceptable security risk if allowed to retain operational memories. But beneath that clinical assessment was a handwritten note in different ink. Subject's sister Margaret found dead in apparent overdose 3 days after subject's final mission. Recommend accelerated timeline for memory modification before subject learns of her death. His reaction could compromise entire operation. Clay felt something break inside his chest. Margaret was dead, had been dead for 50 years, and they'd erased his memory of her death along with everything else, leaving him to spend decades wondering why he felt such persistent grief for a sister he could barely remember. "She's gone," Clay said, the words cutting through him like broken glass. "They used her to control me, and then they let her die. And they made me forget I ever loved her." Morrison's radio crackled with urgent transmissions. The helicopters were inbound, and their time was running out. But Clay couldn't move, couldn't think beyond the crushing weight of what he'd discovered about himself. He wasn't the man he'd thought he was. He was a killer, a conspirator, a man who'd traded his humanity for a sister's life and then lost them both. The quiet, reflective person he'd built over 50 years of half-remembered existence was a fiction constructed on foundations of enforced amnesia and institutional murder. "Clay," Morrison said urgently, "we have to go. If those helicopters destroy this place, the truth dies with it." Clay looked around the chamber where Blackwood had carved the names of his victims whose deaths Clay had helped enable by continuing the preacher's research. 212 people, plus 47 more who died in the Nevada facility, plus Margaret, plus God knew how many others over the past 50 years. The weight of it should have crushed him. But instead, Clay felt something else stirring in the ruins of his shattered identity. Not guilt or despair, but a cold, burning anger that cut through the confusion like a blade. They'd stolen his memory, his identity, his love for his sister, and 50 years of his life. They'd turned him into a monster and then made him forget what he'd become. But in doing so, they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd left him alive, and Clay Donovan, the real Clay Donovan, the one who'd killed Blackwood and 47 others, was very good at making people pay for their mistakes. The sound of approaching helicopters echoed across the desert as Clay methodically gathered every piece of evidence they could carry. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but his mind was calculating something entirely different from escape routes. For the first time in 50 years, he was planning to kill people, and he was remembering exactly how good he used to be at it. "Clay, we need to move now," Morrison urged, stuffing documents into waterproof bags. "There's an extraction point 2 miles north where my people can pick us up." "No extraction," Clay said calmly, checking his rifle and counting his remaining ammunition. "We're not running from this." Morrison stopped packing and stared at him. "What are you talking about? Those helicopters are carrying enough firepower to level this entire area. Then we better make sure they don't get the chance to use it." Clay was studying the personnel files he'd discovered, memorizing names and faces. The network that had grown out of Blackwood's research wasn't just a government cover-up anymore. It was a private empire built on institutional murder. And according to the documents, several key players in that empire were coordinating today's cleanup operation from a command center in Las Vegas. "Morrison, how many of your people know about what we found down here?" "Just my immediate team. Maybe 6 people total. And how many of them do you trust with your life?" Morrison considered the question seriously. 2? Maybe 3. That's not good enough. Clay was mapping out the tunnel system in his head, remembering details he'd somehow absorbed during his first exploration. "This operation has been compromised from the beginning. Someone in your chain of command tipped off the contractors about our location." The implications hit Morrison like a physical blow. "You think there's a mole in my agency?" "I think your entire agency is compromised. Has been since 1973. Clay showed him a document from Blackwood's files, a list of government officials who'd been recruited to continue the biological weapons research. The names included Morrison's current supervisor and at least 3 other senior figures in his department. "My God," Morrison whispered. "We're not just fighting the contractors. We're fighting our own people." The radio transmissions Clay had been monitoring confirmed his suspicions. The helicopter strike wasn't being coordinated by independent contractors. It was a joint operation between private military companies and elements within the federal government. People who'd spent 50 years protecting the Mercy Ridge secret weren't about to let it be exposed now. But Clay had advantages they didn't know about. His memory might have been selectively erased, but his training remained intact. Muscle memory, tactical instincts, and the cold calculation that had made him an effective assassin, none of that had been touched by the memory modification. And now, with his true past revealed, those suppressed skills were surfacing like weapons emerging from deep storage. "How many helicopters?" Clay asked, listening to the radio chatter. 3 gunships, plus a transport with additional ground forces. "Maybe 40 combatants total," Clay nodded, working through the tactical situation. The enemy had superior firepower and numbers, but they were operating in unfamiliar terrain with a mission timeline that worked against them. They needed to destroy the evidence quickly and quietly, which limited their options for heavy weapons use. They can't just blow up the tunnels, Clay realized. Too much risk of exposure. Chemical contamination, radioactive materials, biological agents. If any of that gets into the groundwater or becomes airborne, they'll have an environmental disaster that brings in federal investigators they can't control. Morrison was beginning to understand Clay's thinking. So they have to come down here and sanitize everything by hand, which means close quarters combat in confined spaces. And that's where we have the advantage. Clay had been unconsciously preparing for this confrontation since he'd first descended into Blackwood's chambers. Every time he'd explored the tunnels, he'd noted potential ambush points, escape routes, and defensive positions. Now those observations were crystallizing into a comprehensive battle plan. "Morrison, I need you to contact your most trusted people and have them start uploading everything we've found to secure servers outside government control. News outlets, foreign intelligence agencies, anyone who can get the story out if we don't survive this. What about you?" Clay was checking his equipment with the methodical precision of someone preparing for war. "I'm going to do what I should have done 50 years ago. I'm going to finish the job properly this time." The first helicopter touched down near the church as Clay made his final preparations. Through the periscope he'd improvised from mirrors and the building's broken windows, he could see tactical teams deploying around the entrance to the underground complex. Professional soldiers, well-equipped and moving with the confidence of people who'd done this before. But Clay had done this before too, and he was starting to remember exactly how much he'd enjoyed it. "There's something else you need to know," Morrison said quietly. "The biological weapons research didn't end with that Nevada facility. According to these files, it's still ongoing. The toxins Blackwood developed have been refined and weaponized for use in political assassinations worldwide." Clay wasn't surprised. Organizations that had operated for 50 years didn't simply shut down when their cover was blown. They evolved, adapted, and found new ways to protect their interests, which meant eliminating the current threat wouldn't end the larger conspiracy. "Where's the current research facility?" Morrison consulted the documents. "Multiple locations. But the primary development lab is in a private compound outside Las Vegas, same city where they're coordinating today's operation." "Then that's where this ends." Clay had spent the past hour jury-rigging explosive devices from cleaning supplies and propane tanks he'd found in the church's storage areas. Nothing sophisticated, but effective enough for his purposes. The tunnels that had hidden Blackwood's crimes for 8 decades were about to become a killing ground for the people who'd perpetuated those crimes. "Clay, you don't have to do this alone," Morrison said. "Let me call in support from agencies we can trust." "There aren't any agencies we can trust. This conspiracy reaches too high and goes back too far." Clay was positioning his improvised explosives at critical points throughout the tunnel system. "Besides, this isn't about justice anymore. It's about revenge. And revenge is something a man has to handle personally." The tactical teams were breaching the entrance to the underground complex, moving with practiced efficiency through passages they'd probably mapped during the original 1973 operation. But they were following routes that led them exactly where Clay wanted them to go, into a maze of stone corridors where their superior, Numbers and firepower would become liabilities instead of advantages. Bear had been unusually calm throughout the preparations, as if the dog understood that violence was coming and had made peace with it. Now he positioned himself at Clay's side, golden eyes alert and ready to follow his master into whatever hell was about to unfold in the darkness below Mercy Ridge. "Morrison," Clay said, checking his rifle one final time, "when this is over, make sure the story gets out, all of it. The murders, the cover-up, the ongoing research, the government officials who enabled it, everything. These people have been protected by secrecy for 50 years. It's time to drag them into the light." The sound of boots echoing through the stone passages told Clay that the first tactical team had reached the main chamber. Soon they'd discover that their quarry hadn't fled. He'd been waiting for them to come close enough to kill. Clay smiled grimly as he moved into position for the ambush. For the first time in 5 decades, he felt like himself again. Not the confused old man who'd bought cursed land to escape his past, but the trained killer who'd once been very good at making problems disappear. The only difference was that this time, he was going to remember every moment of it. The first tactical team died so quickly they never had a chance to radio for help. Clay had positioned himself in the shadows of the main storage chamber, using the shelves of victims' belongings as concealment. When the 6-man team entered the room with their weapons raised and night vision goggles scanning for targets, he was already moving behind them like a ghost from their own nightmares. The suppressed rifle whispered 3 times in rapid succession, dropping the point man and his backup before they could process the threat. The remaining 4 spun toward the muzzle flashes, but Clay was no longer there. He'd rolled behind a collapsed shelf, using the maze of stored belongings to break their sightlines and force them into close-quarters combat, where their tactical advantage evaporated. Bear struck from the opposite direction, 40 pounds of muscle and fury tearing into the team's communications specialist. The man's scream was cut short by Clay's knife, emerging from the shadows to open his throat with the cold efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. The surviving 3 operators tried to fall back to the tunnel entrance, but Clay's improvised explosives turned their retreat into a trap. The first blast brought down tons of stone, sealing the passage and cutting off their escape route. The second explosion triggered a rockfall that crushed 2 of the fleeing soldiers, beneath debris that had stood firm for over a century. The last operator, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, found himself alone in the darkness with a killer who'd been perfecting his craft since before the soldier was born. Clay could have ended it quickly, but something in the man's face reminded him of his younger self. The scared, confused look of someone who'd gotten involved in something far beyond his understanding. "Drop your weapon," Clay said quietly, emerging from the shadows with his rifle trained on the operator's chest. The young soldier hesitated, then let his assault rifle clatter to the stone floor. "You're Donovan." "That's right. They told us you were a terrorist, that you'd stolen classified weapons research and were planning to sell it to foreign agents." Clay almost laughed at the irony. "And you believed them?" "I believed my commanding officers." The soldier's voice was steady despite his situation. "Same as you probably did when you were my age." That hit closer to home than Clay wanted to acknowledge. This young man was what he'd been 50 years ago, a trained killer following orders without questioning their moral implications. The only difference was that Clay had been lucky enough to have his memory erased before the guilt could destroy him. "What's your name, soldier?" "Staff Sergeant David Kim, sir." "Well, David, you've got a choice to make. You can try to complete your mission and end up dead in these tunnels with your teammates. Or you can listen to what I'm about to tell you and maybe walk out of here with some understanding of what you've really been fighting for." Kim glanced at the bodies of his fallen comrades, then back at Clay. "I'm listening." Clay kept his rifle trained on the young soldier while he explained what they'd discovered in Blackwood's archives. The biological weapons research, the decades of murder, the government conspiracy that had protected mass killers for profit and political advantage. As he spoke, he watched Kim's expression change from skepticism to horror, to something that might have been understanding. The people who sent you here aren't protecting national security, Clay concluded. They're protecting their own criminal enterprise. And they're willing to kill anyone who threatens their profits. Kim was quiet for a long moment, processing what he'd heard. How do I know you're telling the truth? Clay gestured toward the shelves of victims' belongings that surrounded them. Look around you. 212 people died in these chambers. Men, women, children, all of them murdered for the crime of traveling through the wrong valley at the wrong time. Do you think they were all terrorists and foreign agents? The soldier's eyes moved across the collection of suitcases, toys, and personal items. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. What do you want from me? I want you to survive long enough to tell people what you've seen here. Because in about 10 minutes, the people who sent you are going to realize their first team isn't coming back. And when that happens, they're going to level this entire area to destroy the evidence. Kim checked his radio and found only static. They're jamming communications. Standard procedure for this kind of operation. They can't risk word getting out about what they're really doing here. Clay was monitoring the tactical frequencies on his own radio, listening to increasingly frustrated attempts to contact the dead soldiers. Soon the commanders outside would realize they'd lost their advance team and would move to more aggressive tactics. Sergeant Kim, I need you to understand something. The men who sent you here have been covering up mass murder for 50 years. They've killed witnesses, eliminated whistleblowers, and assassinated anyone who got too close to the truth. You're not a soldier anymore. You're a loose end that needs to be tied off. You're saying they'll kill me too. I'm saying they'll try. Unless you help me make sure the truth gets out first. Kim was struggling with the implications of what Clay was telling him. The young soldier had probably joined the military with genuine patriotic motives, only to find himself participating in operations that violated everything he'd thought he was fighting for. What do you need me to do? Clay showed him Morrison's position deeper in the tunnel system, where the federal agent was still photographing and uploading documents. Help him get the evidence to safety. These archives contain proof of decades of war crimes committed by American officials. If that information reaches the right people, it could bring down the entire network. And what are you going to do? Clay checked his remaining ammunition and explosive devices. I'm going to buy you time by making sure the second tactical team doesn't make it any further than the first one did. Kim looked around. At the carnage Clay had created in less than 10 minutes, 6 professional soldiers killed, with cold efficiency in a confined space that should have favored their superior numbers and equipment. You're going to fight them alone? I've been fighting them alone for 50 years. I just didn't know it until today. The radio chatter indicated that the helicopter crews were growing impatient with the lack of communication from the underground teams. Clay could hear rotors spinning up and tactical commanders discussing more aggressive options. Soon they'd start using heavier weapons to force entry into the tunnel system. Go, Clay told Kim. Find Morrison and help him upload everything to secure servers. If I don't make it out, make sure the story gets told properly. Kim gathered his equipment and started toward the deeper tunnels, then paused. For what it's worth, I'm sorry about what they did to you. And to your sister. Clay watched the young soldier disappear into the darkness, then turned his attention to preparing for the next wave of attackers. He'd given Kim and Morrison maybe 20 minutes to complete their work before the tunnels became completely untenable. 20 minutes to expose 50 years of conspiracy and murder. It would have to be enough. The sound of explosives echoing through the stone passages told Clay that the second tactical team was breaching the sealed entrance he'd created. But they were moving more cautiously now, aware that they were walking into prepared kill zones where their predecessors had died. Clay smiled grimly as he moved into position for the next phase of his war against the people who'd stolen his life. He might not remember being an assassin, but his body remembered. Every lesson it had learned about killing efficiently, in confined spaces, and he was about to remind his enemies why. They'd needed to erase his memory in the first place. The second tactical team learned from their predecessors' mistakes. Instead of advancing through the main passages, they used shaped charges to blast new entrances through the tunnel walls, bypassing Clay's prepared ambush points and forcing him to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. Clay found himself pinned down in Blackwood's laboratory chamber as gunfire echoed through the stone corridors from 3 different directions. The tactical teams had split into smaller units, using their superior numbers to flush him out of defensive positions. But they'd also made themselves vulnerable to the kind of guerrilla warfare Clay had perfected in jungles and mountains half a world away. Bear had vanished into the maze of side passages, using his smaller size and better knowledge of the terrain to harass the advancing soldiers. Clay could hear occasional yelps of pain and cursed radio chatter as the dog struck from concealment, then melted back into the darkness before the soldiers could retaliate effectively. The laboratory chamber provided Clay with improvised weapons that the tactical teams hadn't anticipated. Glass beakers filled with chemical residue became grenades when combined with his remaining explosives. Broken equipment generated shrapnel that turned narrow passages into killing zones. And the laboratory's ventilation system allowed him to move between chambers without exposing himself to direct fire. But the real advantage came from Clay's growing understanding of his enemy's limitations. These weren't just soldiers following orders. They were participants in a conspiracy that required absolute secrecy to survive, which meant they couldn't simply demolish the tunnels and bury the evidence. They needed to sanitize the site carefully, removing every trace of the research that had been conducted here. That need for precision was what allowed Clay to turn the tables on his pursuers. Using Blackwood's oil lamp system, Clay ignited a trail of accelerant that led through multiple chambers before terminating in a storage area filled with the preacher's chemical experiments. The resulting explosion wasn't just destructive, it was precisely calculated to release a cloud of unknown toxins into the tunnel system's air circulation. The tactical teams found themselves fighting in an environment that required hazmat protection, but their mission parameters hadn't included chemical warfare equipment. Within minutes, soldiers were reporting respiratory distress, skin irritation, and visual impairment from exposure to 50-year-old biological agents that had been slowly degrading in the underground chambers. Clay, protected by an improvised gas mask created from Blackwood's laboratory equipment, moved through the chemical haze like a specter of death. The soldiers' night vision goggles were useless in the contaminated atmosphere. While their radio communications were degraded by the stone, walls, and electronic interference from their own jamming equipment, the 3rd Tactical Team tried to retreat. When they realized the underground environment had become untenable, but Clay's final improvised explosive brought down the ceiling of the main access tunnel. 20 tons of stone sealed the entrance, trapping the remaining soldiers in a tomb that had been designed for exactly this purpose. In the sudden silence that followed the rockfall, Clay could hear the muffled sound of helicopter rotors above and the distant voices of commanders trying to establish communication with their missing teams. 47 professional soldiers had entered the tunnels beneath Mercy Ridge. None of them would be leaving. Clay made his way through the chemical haze to the deepest chamber, where Morrison and Sergeant Kim were completing their documentation of Blackwood's archives. Both men looked up as he appeared through the smoke, his face grim with the satisfaction of completed vengeance. "Is it done?" Morrison asked. "The immediate threat is eliminated, but there are still helicopters above, and the people who sent them aren't going to simply give up and go home." Kim was monitoring radio frequencies on his equipment. "They're calling in additional support. Military helicopters, heavy weapons, maybe even an airstrike. Then we need to get this information uploaded immediately," Morrison said, connecting his equipment to a satellite communication system. "Once the evidence reaches secure servers outside their control, they'll lose the ability to suppress it." Clay watched the upload progress bar crawling across Morrison's screen. 50 years of secrets, thousands of pages of documentation, proof of crimes that reached into the highest levels of government, all of it streaming through encrypted channels to news organizations and foreign intelligence. Agencies that couldn't be silenced or bought off, but the process was taking too long. Clay could hear the helicopters repositioning above, and the radio chatter indicated that someone in authority had made the decision to simply destroy the entire site, regardless of collateral damage. "How much longer?" Clay asked. "Maybe 10 minutes for the complete." "Okay, we don't have 10 minutes. Clay was already moving toward the chamber's secondary exit, a passage that Blackwood had carved to connect his laboratory with a natural cave system that extended for miles beneath the desert. It was their only chance of escaping before the helicopters turned the Mercy Ridge site into a crater. "Morrison, grab the most critical files and whatever portable storage you can carry. Leave the rest. But this is decades of evidence, and none of it matters if we're dead." Clay was checking his remaining ammunition and emergency supplies. "Kim, can you guide us through the cave system to a safe extraction point?" The young sergeant consulted a topographical map. "There's an old mining road about 3 miles north. If we can reach it, my people should be able to pick us up." "Your people?" Kim's expression was grim. "The ones who aren't part of this conspiracy. Assuming there are any left." Clay led them through Blackwood's escape tunnel as the sound of heavy weapons fire began echoing through the stone passages behind them. The helicopters were using bunker-buster missiles to collapse the underground complex, erasing a century of evidence, along with the bodies of the soldiers who died trying to protect it. As they climbed through natural caverns toward the desert surface, Clay reflected on the irony of their situation. He'd spent 50 years running from a past he couldn't remember, only to discover that his forgotten life had been built on foundations of murder and betrayal. Now he was running again, but this time he knew exactly what he was running from and exactly what he intended to do about it. The cave system emerged into moonlight 3 miles from Mercy Ridge, where the sound of explosions was still echoing across the desert. Behind them, the site where Reverend Blackwood had conducted his 80-year reign of terror was disappearing beneath tons of rubble and government ordnance. But the evidence of his crimes, and the crimes of everyone who'd protected him, was already spreading through secure networks beyond the reach of the people who'd tried to bury it. Morrison's upload had completed just minutes before the final demolition, ensuring that the truth would survive even if they didn't. Clay looked back at the distant flashes of light marking the destruction of Mercy Ridge, then turned toward the road where Kim's extraction team was waiting. For the first time in 50 years, he felt like he knew who he was and what he needed to do next. The conspiracy that had stolen his memory and murdered his sister was about to discover that some things couldn't be buried permanently. And Clay Donovan was very good at digging up the past. 6 months later, Clay Donovan sat on the porch of a different cabin in a different state, watching Bear chase rabbits through tall grass that had never been stained with blood. The dog had aged in the months since Mercy Ridge, his golden coat now more gray than gold. But his eyes still held the keen intelligence that had led them to the truth buried beneath that cursed ground. The world had changed in the wake of Morrison's document release. Congressional hearings had exposed the biological weapons conspiracy, bringing down 3 cabinet-level officials and leading to the arrest of dozens of military contractors and government employees. Foreign intelligence agencies had confirmed the authenticity of Blackwood's research, forcing the United States to acknowledge decades of illegal weapons development and human experimentation. But for Clay, the most important change was simpler and more personal. For the first time in 50 years, he could remember his sister's face clearly. Not just fragments and impressions, but actual memories of Margaret Donovan. Her laugh, her stubborn determination to see the good in everyone, and the way she'd looked at him with absolute trust when he'd promised to keep her safe, a promise he'd failed to keep. Despite sacrificing his own humanity in the attempt, the memory modification that had stolen 5 decades of his life was gradually wearing off, triggered by the trauma of rediscovering his buried past. Clay was remembering more each day, not just the operations he'd participated in, but the guilt and horror that had driven him to accept the government's offer of artificial amnesia. The faces of people he'd killed, the research he'd helped conduct, and the terrible moment when he'd learned that Margaret had died while he was serving the very people who'd threatened her life. Morrison visited occasionally, bringing updates on the ongoing investigations and the trials of surviving conspirators. The federal agent had been reassigned to a new department specifically created to investigate historical government crimes, but he carried the weight of his discoveries like a physical burden. Learning that his own father had been murdered as part of a biological weapons program had changed Morrison in ways that went beyond professional responsibility. "Any word on the Nevada facility?" Clay asked during Morrison's most recent visit, shut down permanently. "The entire complex has been turned over to the CDC for decontamination and analysis." Morrison sipped his coffee and watched bears' futile pursuit of wildlife. They found remains of 73 test subjects in the deep storage areas, all of them people who disappeared from federal custody between 1974 and 1995. Clay nodded, adding those deaths to the count he carried in his memory. 212 victims in Blackwood's chambers, 47 in the Nevada facility, 73 more in subsequent operations. Over 300 people murdered in the name of weapons research that had been used to assassinate political opponents and foreign dissidents for decades. What about the international connections? That's where it gets complicated. The research wasn't just sold to foreign governments, it was traded for intelligence and political favors. Half the proxy wars of the past 30 years had some connection to Blackwood's toxins. Morrison showed Clay photographs from crime scenes around the world, politicians, journalists and activists who died from mysterious illnesses that perfectly mimicked natural causes. Heart attacks, strokes, and neurological failures that had eliminated inconvenient voices without leaving traces of foul play. "The body count is going to be in the thousands when we're done investigating," Morrison said quietly, "and most of the victims will never be officially acknowledged because their deaths were designed to look accidental." Clay studied the photographs, recognizing the precision that characterized toxins he'd helped test 50 years earlier. Somewhere in his suppressed memories were formulas and procedures that had enabled decades of invisible murder. The knowledge made him feel complicit in every death, even though his conscious mind had been stolen along with his memories. But remembering also brought unexpected revelations. Among the faces in his recovered memories was a young chemist named Dr. Sarah Chen, who'd worked at the Nevada facility during Clay's time there. Unlike most of the research staff, Dr. Chen had expressed doubts about the ethical implications of their work. Clay remembered her trying to document the human cost of their experiments, secretly photographing victims and keeping detailed records of their suffering. "Morrison, I need you to look into someone. Dr. Sarah Chen worked at the Nevada facility in the mid-70s. Morrison made a note. "What about her?" "She was trying to expose the program from the inside. If she survived, she might have evidence we haven't found yet." A week later, Morrison returned with news that transformed Clay's understanding of his own past. Dr. Chen was still alive, living under an assumed identity in Canada, and she'd been waiting 30 years for someone to contact her about the research she'd witnessed at the Nevada facility. The meeting took place in a small cafe in Vancouver, where an elderly Asian woman with kind eyes and careful hands recognized Clay immediately, despite the 50 years that had aged them both. "I remember you," Dr. Chen said quietly. "You were different from the others. You asked questions about what we were doing to people. You tried to help some of the test subjects when the supervisors weren't watching." Clay felt pieces of his buried conscience stirring. "I don't remember that. They made sure you wouldn't, but I kept records of everything, including your attempts to minimize the suffering we were causing." Dr. Chen handed him a thick envelope. "I've been waiting decades for someone to ask me about those files." Inside the envelope were photographs, test results, and detailed documentation of the Nevada facility's operations. But more importantly, they contained evidence of Clay's resistance to the program, records of times he'd sabotaged experiments, falsified results to protect test subjects, and eventually threatened to expose the entire operation if it continued. According to my notes, you were scheduled for termination in late 1974, Dr. Chen explained. But someone in authority decided that memory modification was a safer option than murder. Too many people had already died, and eliminating you would have raised questions they couldn't answer. Clay stared at the photographs that showed a younger version of himself trying to treat victims of chemical exposure. His face twisted with anguish at what he was being forced to participate in. This wasn't the cold-blooded assassin he'd believed himself to be. This was a man who'd been broken by the horror of what he'd been ordered to do. Why didn't you expose this earlier? Dr. Chen's smile was sad but understanding. Because they threatened my family, too. My children, my husband, my elderly parents, all of them would have died if I'd spoken out. So I documented everything and waited for the right moment. Waited for someone like you to come forward with enough evidence to protect all of us. Clay left Vancouver with a different understanding of his past and his choices. The man he'd been 50 years ago hadn't been a willing participant in mass murder. He'd been a victim of institutional coercion who'd tried to minimize harm while trapped in an impossible situation. The memory modification hadn't just hidden his crimes. It had hidden his attempts to resist those crimes. Back at his new cabin, Clay sat with Bear and watched the sun set over mountains that held no buried secrets. For the first time in his adult life, he felt something approaching peace. Not because he'd been absolved of responsibility for the deaths he'd enabled, but because he finally understood the full context of his choices and sacrifices. Margaret's photograph sat on his kitchen table now, not the driver's license, photo he'd found in Blackwood's storage chamber, but a picture Dr. Chen had given him of his sister visiting the Nevada facility just days before her death. Margaret had come looking for Clay, worried about his increasingly erratic letters and desperate to bring him home. She died of a drug overdose, as the records indicated. But according to Dr. Chen's files, the drugs had been administered against her will by facility security after she'd threatened to expose their operations. Margaret Donovan had been murdered for the crime of loving her brother enough to try to save him from the people who were destroying his soul. Clay had spent 50 years running from a guilt he couldn't remember. Now he could remember everything, and the guilt was transformed into something more focused and purposeful. Justice had been served for some of the conspiracy's crimes, but not all of them. And there were people still alive who needed to answer for what they'd done to Margaret and hundreds of others. Bear lifted his grey muzzle and looked at Clay with eyes that held the wisdom of a long life shared with someone who'd finally found his way home. The dog seemed to understand that their time together was drawing to a close, not because of illness or age, but because Clay had one final journey to make, a journey that would take him to places where old men settled old scores, and where the ghosts of Mercy Ridge could finally find the rest they'd been denied for over a century. Clay Donovan had spent 50 years learning to live with forgotten sins. Now he would spend whatever time remained learning to live with remembered ones. And perhaps, in the process, he would find a way to honor the memory of a sister who died trying to save a brother who couldn't be saved. The mountains held their silence as Clay made his plans. Some stories ended with justice, others with revenge, and a few lucky ones ended with redemption. Clay wasn't sure which ending he was writing, but for the first time in decades, he was writing it with full knowledge of what he'd lost and what he intended to reclaim. Bear curled up beside his chair as darkness settled over the valley, and Clay allowed himself to remember Margaret's voice calling his name across the years, calling him home to a reckoning that was 50 years overdue.